Hello, everyone. I think while we're getting a little bit set up, I'll just go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Nicole Pizarro, and I am my co-moderator today is DRC Neal. And today we will be joined by Jennings, Margaret Noodin, Michal, Raizen, and Stanford Carpenter for the second Pro Scholars Roundtable of the day. And before we begin the Q&A and the whole conversation, could each of the panelists, I know they're still coming in and doing all the things, could each of the panelists tell us a little bit about how you became interested in comics, like who are you, what do you do, what projects you're working on, etc.? Perhaps we can start with John and then Stanford and Margaret. That's just how I'm seeing y'all.
Okay. Yeah, so my name is Jennings. I'm a professor of media and cultural studies at the University of California at Riverside. And I've been interested in comics for as long as I can remember, honestly. The culprit that got me interested in comics was my mom, you know? I was a huge reader of like mythology and folklore as a kid. And I think she saw the connections between, you know, a character like, you know, Thor, for instance, you know, which was a huge, one of my favorite characters early on. And also I grew up like, you know, listening to my grandmother's folk tales and spook stories, you know, in the middle of Mississippi. So I became really interested in stories and graphic stories very early and started, you know, trying to draw my own very early as well. And so those are some of the early beginnings of it. And, you know, I just kind of ended up studying race and representation and in comics, and also started doing like a lot of work around graphic design work. So because my training is actually in graphic design as a practitioner. As far as like current projects, there are numerous. I just finished a adaptation of a short story into a graphic novel by Nnedi Okorafor from my new new line of comics with Abrams books that are centered around Black people and people of color and speculative fiction. So it's the first book of that series. Working on a new show with Stacey Robinson, who's the other half of Black Kirby, based around Larry Fuller's Eben character, which is one of the first independent Black superhero characters ever created. It's going to be here at UCR. And I'm doing a lot of editing and that kind of thing too. But most recently, of course, was the adaptation of Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower into a graphic novel, also from Abrams Comic Arts. And yeah, I'm going to pass the visual mic. But thank you for having me. I'm very excited for the conversation.
Thank you so much. Stanford?
Hello, and thank you for having me. I'm Stanford Carpenter. I guess the best way I could describe how I got into comics was my mom read them to me as a child, and I loved them. She was an ESL teacher, and one day, you know, she didn't read me my comics on demand. So to spite her, I learned to read myself. She described it as I literally locked myself in the room for the better part of a couple weeks, and then I came out and I was turning the pages, and she was like, "Wait, you're actually reading them." And then for me, it was kind of a circuitous route. I went to college. I was an athlete in college in cross country and track. I got to Oberlin College, and you couldn't major in comics, and I didn't want to do like a personally designed major, so I just took random courses that I never heard of or thought of taking, and I did well in one course, and that was archaeology. So the archaeology professor invited me to go out in some archaeological field schools, and so I started off in archaeology, but I still continued my love of comics, and she knew I loved comics. At the time I was drawing comics all the time, and she actually her pitch for me to be in archaeology, you know, the conversation went like this. She's like, "You should consider archaeology," and I'm like, you know, this archaeology stuff seems really cool. I love reading about it. I said, but I would hate sitting in like a cube and digging with a toothbrush. It does not sound like fun at all to me. And she's like, yeah, I figured that about you, but most archaeologists love digging and they hate doing map making and survey work, and you're really good artists. So I'm going to train you to be a map maker and an illustrator for archaeological digs. So I said yes, and I ended up doing that on and off for quite some time. In the meantime, I also ended up doing a comic strip eventually ended up in Portland, Oregon, where I did a comic strip retelling African folktales. And I had kept in touch with my archaeology professor from Oberlin, and she had seen it, and I was going on vacation to New York City, and it was like around Christmas, and she just nagged me. She was just like, and it was also my, and it was also the same with one of my other archaeology professors. His name was Bruce Simonson, and when I graduated from undergrad, I went over to talk to him. I was like, "Thank you so much." I said the same thing to Linda. I said, "Thank you so much for helping me get out of here in 4 years, but I'm never opening another book again. I'm gonna go off and become a comic creator, or I want to go off and learn and do comics." I'm like, I'm done with this, and they both just laughed. And Bruce gave me this piece of paper, and I opened it up, and on it was a phone number. And I'm like, "What's this?" He's like, "That's my brother's phone number." Bruce Simonson's brother is Walter Simonson. And so I met Walter Simonson. I'm doing the comic strip. Linda had been like, you need to show these comic strips to some anthropologists, because what you're doing is a lot of your source material are coming from folklore collected by anthropologists. And I was like, okay. And she was really persistent. I get there, and I literally cold called the departments of anthropology at NYU, Columbia, and also Temple, because I did a day trip out to Philadelphia. And I just ended up getting in conversations with different anthropology professors. And I had this one really long one with Nick Tausig at Columbia. And by the end of the conversation, we started in his office. We ended up on the train, and then he got to his dental appointment. I went off and did my thing. And he convinced me to go there for my master's degree. So I got back to Portland, put my comic strip on hiatus, and then went to Columbia, where I ended up working with Mick and also with Patricia Williams. And then while I was there, I mean, everything for me was happenstance. While I was there, I was experimenting with doing comics and anthropology and different social cultural theory. And I had sent my work out to a whole bunch of different professors at other departments, and I got a message from George Marcus over at Rice University, and he was like, "You should consider coming here for your PhD." And I was like, "Okay." So I did, and I ended up. That was where I ended up doing my dissertation research, and they set up my funding so I could still do work as an artist. So that's how I got into it. It was very much by accident, or I wouldn't say accident. It was throughout this entire journey, I was always fascinated with the way comics could tell stories. And I was fascinated with the way comics could tell stories in a way that were visceral. But I wasn't necessarily enthusiastic about the content. I felt excluded by the content. And I just had this general idea of these topics, like even the folklore. It was a recovery process for me. It was about digging things up that people normally wouldn't see. I loved archaeology. I loved doing the map making and the survey work. But that became very much a guiding principle, even as I did my anthropological work, where much of what I do is a very archaeological sensibility of peeling up layers. Reconstruction is something I'm very interested in, especially as applied to creative processes. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into it, how I got to where I'm at now. Right now, as far as projects I'm working on, I am we're supposed to start it right before COVID. It got delayed, but I'm working on a NPR affiliate podcast that will focus on comics and culture. I'm doing that with, I have a partner in that, and it'll be coming out soon. We call Brother Story and the Correspondent, named for my cartoon alter ego, and Sienna Greaves' cartoon alter ego. I just found out today that I'll be doing a series of roundtable discussions about Lovecraft Country and Candyman for the Chicago History Museum. So that's what I do to keep from being bored.
That's amazing.
Casually drop that in like it's not a big deal, but
right, it's like mic drop. Gosh. Margaret Noodin.
So I think the way that I typically come at a lot of this is through the language. I mean, that's kind of, I guess, the angle I bring to the table here at the conversation. So I'm an Anishinaabe. I teach Anishinaabe in one language. I have done that in the Great Lakes region, anywhere from Minnesota, over in Michigan, up in Ontario. I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin now. And a lot of people don't realize we still use our language. So sometimes I'm working on projects that connect with old ideas of mapping and storytelling through visual means, and using language that, you know, explains those. And then sometimes I'm working with contemporary artists to do things to give kids a way to access the language now. So some of the older things are to work with the pictographs and petroglyphs that we've got in the Great Lakes region. There's some up at Hegman Lake. There's some in Sanilac. There's a wide range of things where we have characters like the classic water panther, a number of characters that are really relevant, I think, still today. They kind of embody things like riptides, things we still deal with, but they're old images, connecting them now, visual and story kind of connections. And then recently, I think it's more been some work with people like Elizabeth LaPonce and Bernie Parley, folks who are kind of coming at some of the same things already mentioned by Stanford and John, looking at ways to rethink anthropology and archaeology and retell our stories. I'm just usually pushing pretty hard to do it in either a bilingual mode or a monolingual Anishinaabe mode, just to remind people we've still got our language and we know how to use it. You know, maybe I'll leave it there for now, and it's great to be here today and have this conversation with you all.
I was going to say, as a rhetoric person in the rhetoric department, I greatly appreciate that, because trying to establish a connection between a degree that doesn't seem to be connected seems to be a continuous fight. So I definitely appreciate that. And I saw your TED Talk on language, and I really enjoy the comment that you made about language as energy and like verbs as energy. But anyway, last but not least, Dr. Raizen.
All right, well, first I want to say a huge thank you. I'm very, very honored to be here. So I'm a professor of comparative literature. I took a cartooning class when I was 8, and I drew a dodo bird, and that was the end of it. I'm not an artist. But where I come into this conversation is that in 2011, I was in graduate school. I did a year in Cairo at the Center for Arabic Study Abroad. So I was there during the Arab Spring, just a few months after Hosni Mubarak was deposed. And one of the very first things I saw in Cairo was a mural of a chessboard, and the king was down. And it was just such a powerful moment. And I was there at the moment when all the graffiti came up on the walls, when Tahrir Square started to be walled off to protesters, when there were street battles. So I was there witnessing all of that street art coming up. And at the same time, I was, my kind of specialization was literature, and I was taking all literature classes, Palestinian literature, the Arabic novel, whatnot. And it really got me thinking about how do some of these ideas move from the page to the wall to the street. And it really, I think before that, I had not considered that fluidity so much. And then it took me a few more years. I finished my dissertation, and then at Ohio Wesleyan, where I teach now, I started to teach a graphic and experimental novel course. And what's come up for me there is that kind of in the wake of the Arab Spring, you know, unfortunately, these movements they've kind of resulted in a lot of heartache and failure. But what's happened there is, I think, an opening for new kinds of conversations, and where those conversations are most concentrated in the Arabic-speaking world is in graphic literature, and kind of a whole spectrum between graffiti, blogs, multimedia, graphic literature, experimental literature. And they're asking the very questions that were coming up on the walls. So how do we see ourselves as a society? I'm interested in the idea of how has being Arab been defined at different points in time? And I think this is a big question that is coming up right now in terms of the minorities that left Egypt all the way back to the 1950s. So people are asking, in this new kind of explosion of graphic literature and art and multimedia, how are we defining Arabness? What does it exclude? What does it include? How is it shifting? So that I'm finding that those resources and those kind of visual cues are very, very important for how this is being discussed. So kind of one of my areas of concentration is that I'm really interested in the Jewish minority that had to leave the Arab world, essentially, in kind of the cross currents of Arab nationalism and Jewish nationalism, or Zionism. And that at some point in the 1950s, Arab and Jew became these kind of antagonistic terms of identification. And there's a very robust conversation right now happening in both graphic literature and kind of more conventional publication about that minority. I kind of think of it as a ghost history that people are starting to talk about. And I think that the visual medium is incredibly powerful for how to tell those stories. There's just an absolute explosion of literature right now. And I'm working on some graphic novels that deal with those histories.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you were talking about like the graffiti and the protest, and that leads perfectly into the first question that we have, and it's Michal, right? Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the first question that I actually have, it's for Stanford and Michal. So in thinking about the idea of Sanchez and Moore, they talk about a question of the remix of resistance, which is basically that the meaning that an image or a place has or a culture has changes depending on who is the one that is producing the art. And that meaning can be changed if the state decides that, you know, they want it to mean something else. And so my question is, how do you think that graphic work graphic work conveying the power of protests, as well as like transnational activism, might conflict with other viewpoints and like realizations? How do you get people to understand the kind of work that you guys do in a way that affects their lives in real time?
Michal, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can take this. I actually thought it would be kind of helpful to see some visuals from where I was, you know, some of the Arab Spring visuals. This one kind of leads into graphics. So this is another point that's been really interesting for me. Again, I'm going to bring up the word fluidity a million times today. But I think the thing that really struck me about Moore and Sanchez is that a lot of times when we conventionally think about monuments or about memorialization, it's kind of frozen. And the way they see it, especially with the idea of remix, is that it keeps moving and it keeps changing. And that is something, you know, being in the streets in Cairo and seeing all of this art come up, there's something very ephemeral about it, but also the way that it moves between different medias and different genres keeps it going, kind of gives it an afterlife, and then eventually it can go in more than one direction, but it'll end up on the page of a graphic novel, or it'll go the other direction. You know, you all know way more about me in this term about superheroes, but the way that it's been mapped onto kind of superhero comics has been really interesting. So very quickly, I just want to share my screen and look at a couple of images from Cairo. Okay, This one is just a graphic novel that I study, and I don't think we'll have time necessarily to look at that. But I want to look at an image of an incident, a really gruesome incident that happened actually when I was there. Now, I will warn you all, if you're sensitive, this is a pretty difficult image of police brutality towards a woman. So if you need to look away for a little bit, I will tell you as soon as I move to the next slide. Okay, I'll give you a couple of seconds to situate yourselves. Okay, so this is an image of the Central Security Forces, the military. So there was a military counter-revolution, and the protests were co-opted by the military. And there was a woman who was fully, she was wearing a niqab, which is the full covering, meaning the most conservative. And all these women were participating equally in these protests. And the Central Security Forces threw her to the ground, stripped her. And you can see in that image that just kind of second where he's about to really hurt her. And the thing that came out of this was the blue bra. She was wearing this cobalt blue bra, and it became a symbol. And nowadays, people will refer to her as the woman or the girl in the blue bra. And people started saying, I am the girl in the blue bra. All of us are the girl in the blue bra. So I want you to see now from the photograph, okay? And DRC, I think this is getting at your idea of remix, because this is how the image got remixed, okay? Next, we see continued protests in Tahrir Square, where female protesters are holding up the image, okay? Now, just to tell you, this is the end of the graphic images, okay, if you want to look again. Now, this is the way that it got inscribed on one of the walls. What's interesting here is that in the original image, her face was not showing and their faces were showing. Here, you see her face. She's angry. She's got a little bit more agency. Of course, the blue bra is very, very front and center. The subtitle says, Mish Haninsa Yasit al-Banat. She represents all the women. We will never forget, woman of the women, something like that. So all of a sudden, she's become a symbol of the feminist movement within the protests, okay? And the idea that police brutality is connected to the patriarchy, is connected, like all of these brutalities are all intertwined. So then the next three slides didn't necessarily happen in order, but you started to see the blue bra coming up on the wall everywhere as a stencil, okay? Now this is where it gets really interesting. So all of a sudden we have it turn into, you all will know better if it's Wonder Woman or Superwoman, but she's got a tha on her chest, which is short. It's the first letter of Thawra, which is revolution, okay? And underneath it says Mustamira, which means the revolution continues, okay? So the blue bra turned and was refigured and then put on a wall as a superheroine. And, you know, this is making its way on the spectrum towards a more comics sort of medium, but who knows where it'll go from here. It does keep getting remixed, and then it goes back into the street where it's become a symbol of identity, struggle, resistance. So I guess back to your question, DRC, these images become kind of solidified in people's minds as a rallying call to take it back to the street. And then there's an aesthetic element to it. There's that blue, cobalt blue, that people could just latch onto and turn into a symbol that they in turn use as a rallying call. So anyway, that was just to illustrate how I see that remix happening.
Yeah, and Stanford, Dr. Carpenter.
Yeah, I mean, I'm right now I'm struggling with something related to your question. So, you know, in the wake of what happened with George Floyd, Chicago experienced a significant amount of protests, which also resulted in some looting. And it's been interesting for me because I live in the path of it, right? You know, I mean, I literally had a couple of places within a block of my house that, you know, windows broken into. You know, it's pretty well accepted though, and what's been interesting about watching how the looting occurs is and as it's been going on, I've been interviewing a group of comic shop owners, right? And so what's been happening is it's been a chance to kind of like in real time, just like every couple of weeks, we're doing more interviews. And so one of the comic shop owners described it best. He has a comic shop right in downtown Chicago, and he's like he as the comic shop was being looted, he was out like 40 minutes away in the suburbs, watching everything on video from the cameras that he had in the store. And he's like the first people that came in, they had tools. And he was just like, and that's the way he described it. He's just like, they had tools. And then he just like described how it's like, how you could tell that it was a different category of a different class, a different category of intruder, right? So in the wake of all this, I mean, pretty much instantly, you know, a lot of the business started putting up the boards to cover their windows. Businesses that weren't affected were also covering their windows as a way to prevent, you know, to prevent looting from happening. And everything really shut down. We actually had a week where we couldn't buy groceries anywhere, right? Because all the grocery stores were just like, you know, if they'd been hit, they were shut down. If they hadn't been hit, they were shut down. And shortly thereafter, what started happening is you start seeing all these murals popping up on all of the boards, right? Incredible, and a lot of them are Black Lives Matter murals. And it's, on one hand, it's really interesting to see these murals, right? But it's also interesting when you start to realize that some of these murals are being put up, and it's a business having a business that has no political like leaning as far as like Black Lives Matter, is having a Black Lives Matter mural put up right on their window. And it's done almost in a way of like saying, you know, we're friendly to Black people, right? And in my research, one thing that I'm really interested in taking an image or an image, a text, any type of phenomena, and rendering its making co-present. And I think that, and I actually see that as a very important political practice, because we often when we look at these images, it's very much about what we see in the image, and I don't think it's avoidable. What I think is interesting is when you could also get at the stories behind it, and then you're forced to confront the gap between the two. And I actually think that the intent of the creators, the intent of the creator is as interesting and as relevant as the reading of somebody who consumes an object or consumes an image. And so what's interesting is, as part of this one comic organization it's another small comic convention called PocketCon. One of the other people on the board is a woman who is doing murals. So I went and talked to her, and this also has been in conversation with the idea of maybe doing some projects related to this. Is getting behind the stories to these pieces, right? You know, I can walk to the end of my block, make a left-hand turn, and there's this beautiful mural, you know, covering up a window, and I love it. It just says "Black Teachers Matter," right? I've seen, you know, there's stuff that my colleague Natalie she's putting up, you know, and I'm seeing like all of these things, but I'm also seeing them on stores where I'm starting to get the story of the store, right? You know, like there's a Walmart where they got hit pretty hard, and I was there right after they got hit, and there's just this moment where you had all these different people with cameras and you know just videoing what was going on, And then you had people from the community who just walked into the broken windows and just took stuff out. I mean, this woman in her mid 70s walks in, takes a whole bunch of stuff off the shelves, puts it on, and she had gotten so much stuff she couldn't carry it herself. She went out to the crowd and said, "Could somebody help me?" One of the people put his camera in his pocket, went over and helped her carry the stuff home, right? And I actually found that to be really interesting, because this is in a moment where it's clear that no one's going to have groceries for the next week because everything's shut down. And so they've already cleared out, I mean, they've already cleared out the drugstore. They've already cleared out the electronics, right? Now it's just food. And I went over, and there's an armed security guard right there. And I asked the armed security guard, like, what's going on here? He's like, I was called in 4 hours ago, and I was supposed to come here to help, to protect the manager and a couple employees who are going to who are going to clean, secure the building. And I'm here and I'm looking at this. I said, well, are you going to do anything about it? He's like, no. He's like, I have a gun. He's like, if I go there and I try and stop someone, all that's going to happen is I'm going to get hurt, or somebody else is going to get hurt, and and it's going to fall on me. And he says, and ultimately, I've been here for 4 hours, and this company doesn't care enough about their stuff to get anybody here to secure the place. And what's interesting is, like, fast forward a couple days later, right? And Black Lives Matter all over the windows, right? So what I'm interested in is capturing those stories, because I'm also interested in using that as a way to also document sort of how politics and commerce come together. That's an instance where it's like where you have an armed guard saying, I'm not going to get involved in this because why am I protecting somebody's stuff who doesn't care about their stuff that much, right? And so I pose this almost an open-ended question because I'm still in the midst of it, but finding out the stories about how these artists come to put their work on these boards. And one of the things that's really interesting is it's like different artists are coming different ways. Some are coming to it as they're approaching stores and saying, I just want to put art up, right? And they put something up. Others were actually recruited by an ad agency to put this stuff up. It's being sold to the stores on the basis of, well, it will make, it looks better than to just have a piece of plywood. It looks like, you can still keep that plywood up while people are coming in and out. And there already are agreements where something like the ad agency, and then there's actually a set of ones that are actually going over and being turned over to the city that the mayor is going to use for a big push that she's going to do to get more people to participate in the census and to vote. So there's some cynical, some not so cynical, like strategies behind the scenes going towards these images, many of which I love in terms of politically what they say and what many people are consuming at a political level, right?
Yeah, but I was going to say, like, if I could, I was going to add that it sounds a lot like what you're talking about is like being caught up in the horror and trauma of like a city, like in Chicago at the moment in the time that it's happening, and basically being unable to process or produce information that comes as a result of it.
Right.
Which I think is really interesting. I actually wanted to ask, so Dr. Jennings, if you could, like, I know that this is also a central theme that comes up, well, like with Octavia Butler and like the Parable of the Sower. It's a lot of people connected to like horror and trauma of like Black people and Black women in particular. So I was just curious, like when you were looking at this kind of stuff, like was it a similar kind of concept, looking at like horror and trauma of a situation, and like how did you navigate basically how to do the adaptation of taking what Octavia Butler said about it and then like turning it into actual art?
Well, I think that the synthesis of like those particular types of expressions when you're doing adaptations and trying to navigate those things is part of the job, obviously, right? And I think that a lot of times when you're dealing with, particularly when you're dealing with like visual art, you're trying to create in comics, you're trying to create like a shorthand, or you definitely like, it's definitely a process of like a radicalized bricolage or something like that, or also like a remixing process is happening, or a distillation process, because, you know, cartoon is essentially an abstraction. It's about taking away things. And the idea is that, well, how can I create a character or a situation where everyone can relate to, but also is very representative of what the author is stating. And also too, just to be clear, like, you know, there's 3 adapters, right? It was because it's me, Damien, and then Octavia Butler, right? Because Octavia Butler's ideas are at the forefront. So the notion is like, well, what we're trying to do is like understand the meaning of this particular piece and then distill it, you know? It's very difficult not to fall into like traumatizing yourself. One thing I often talk about with that process, particularly with something like Kindred, you know, which I find is extremely disturbing, you know, and actually did win us the Bram Stoker Award for horror, actually, in the graphic novel area. And is that you start out with a particular type of sketchiness, like you have to draw out the entire book. Once Damien has gone through the script and actually like pulled together the main ideas and it's been edited, then I have to like, you know, reify it more and more with each step of the production process. So you sketch it out, you ink it, and then you color it, and then he letters it, right? And so every time that you do that, you know, you're actually kind of like making that those instances more and more realized, more and more, you know, like I said, reified or realistic. And, you know, like I said, there's times when I feel, in particular with Kindred, Parable of Soul is a bit different because I was, you know, my wife was pregnant with our first child at the same time that I was making the book. So there was this kind of, and we live in Southern California now, which is currently on fire, right? So it's like there's a certain amount of like distancing from the subject matter that has to happen. There's also a process where you have to come up with certain types of symbol systems that actually like protect yourself from the pieces, but also make it extremely salient at the same time. It's a balancing act, really. But I literally like cried on to art when I was making Kindred, though, because the whipping scene was just too much, you know. And honestly, it's the first time I've actually admitted this like publicly. Since the book has been published, I have never read it cover to cover since. I have not opened it because it's extremely triggering, you know. Actually, I found it far more disturbing than Parable of the Soul in different ways, just because of the notion that Dana never knows when she's going to travel. And so I've never read the entire book, you know, cover to cover in its final form. So anyway, I also too wanted to know the remix thing right quick, because that was extremely interesting. Particularly the part about the blue bra, it reminded me of of course, a Trayvon Martin hood, of course, right, where it became a shorthand for Trayvon Martin, but also the Bree Newsome incident when she actually climbs the flagpole and snatches down the Confederate flag, you know, in South Carolina. She's turned immediately into a superhero. There's so many images of her as Nubia, the Black Wonder Woman, you know, and I thought that was extremely interesting. You know, because it's kind of like this, like I said, a radicalized bricolage, right? It was like, I think that's part of it. Like when you do satire and remakes, the original intent is always a piece of it there, you know? And which happens is like you start to create like this really kind of like reappropriated visual language that speaks to that notion. I think it was really wonderful. I would love to talk to you more about that, actually. Anyway, so.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jennings, for your answer. So as an adaptation scholar, I am constantly talking and like thinking about like this process of mediating stories and like how we take history and turn it into a tangible product for people and like propagate that story for other audiences. And I kind of wanted to bring in Margaret's work a little bit if we can. Because I'm interested in identity and comics and like the representation of identity in comics. And of course, we've already talked a little bit about Michal's work and Stanford's work and Dr. Jennings's work. But Margaret, could you tell us a little bit more about your work with Ojibwe.net and your upcoming graphic novel? Just because thinking about this representation of the First Nations and identity in these projects. I think you're muted.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. It has a delay. I have really bad internet here, so I turn it off when I'm not talking. But when you guys were talking, one of the things I thought, if I can share, I'll see if I can share the screen for a minute. Just in terms of talking about sort of inscribing language and culture on different things. So this is an article that was recently in the Journal Sentinel here in Milwaukee about my friend Kim Blazer and I. We're both poets. And you can see in this article, there's the big mural of George Floyd. And you can see how this little building here, it's on the corner on a street right in Milwaukee, and how it was kind of taken over with images. And they were images that at first really represented the Black community in the area, but then they began to represent all the different diasporas that are intersecting in that area. And you can see how what happened here is we had a layer of indigeneity kind of come over into that. I have a friend, Brenda, who asked us, she said, we are just tired. We are holding down this space. We are there, we are present, but we are tired. And so Kim, if you look at the picture there, you can tell, so my daughter is the one with the fancy dance outfit there. And then I dance jingle with my friend Kim. And we were both in there, and we realized that when we came into the space, we were sort of layering our language and culture on top of it. I had started using just as an automatic email signature, and every chance I got to get people to realize that we were in solidarity, the little signature, Apit Tendago Zewak Bekadewizijik, so people would hear us saying Black Lives Matter in Ojibwe. And it became really interesting thing to see the way our two cultures work together to support the idea of solidarity. There's another picture in here where you can see in the end, I don't know if I can get it to show you really well, but where you've got all of us kind of merging with the image, which was really interesting. And we felt like this is the kind of thing that we need to do more. I guess my images aren't that great. I could stick them in the chat. But at any rate, just talking about how sometimes what we're doing is with that ojibwe.net site and some of the books that we do, we're recognizing the power of visual images to connect people and then inscribe layers on them, layers of language and layers of story that can represent solidarity from more than one culture. And, you know, it's been really interesting. The other thing we've got is, if you're all on Instagram at all, we have a Instagram account that's Ojibwe_net. And that's one where, again, we try and find ways to connect our language with visual images. In this case, it's often photographs, but you know, a certain percent of the time, it's also a kind of stylized image that usually my older daughter will kind of come up with something that signifies the message that we're trying to put out. So it's kind of like a one image and one message kind of thing. But the power of the visual to really help bring our language into the present is amazing as well. So if you say, you know, all of our histories matter, it's a very different thing when you can say it together in words and images. And we also felt like it was very important at a certain point in time to focus and help others understand that in some instances, on some corners, some days, it's Black lives. That's what matters. And that's what we all need to learn to be okay saying. So, I mean, that's just an example. I think I guess my work, a lot of it is just trying to get the language layered onto the images whenever I can. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, thank you. I really, really appreciate that. I particularly love like how you're talking about the power of the visual image and like how that does so much work for so many people, which is why, of course, graphic novels and comics are so popular and how powerful they are. So one of the questions that I would love to ask, and Dr. Jennings, this is directed to you mainly because, well, A, I'm a huge fan. I didn't get a chance to say that because my camera wasn't working earlier, but I worship at the altar of all the work that you do. So we are actually teaching Parable of the Sower, the graphic novel, in my class this semester. And so I look at your work as like I'm actually gonna plan to use it in my dissertation because it is one of the few representations that I've ever seen of a disabled protagonist front and center in the middle of the story. And for those of you that may have missed my work earlier, y'all know that the work I do is like Afrofuturism and disability, and but I do it through sound studies. So I'm just curious if you could speak to like why that seems to be such a rarity in the comic world, and like it seems like people don't have a problem with race and color, but when you talk to like bodies and disability, that is just not a line that people are willing to do. And so I know that the power of the visual image does a lot of work, but do you think that there's more work that needs to be done?
I think there's always more work to be done in representation, you know, but just to start with. The other thing too, point of clarity, and I'm sorry, and I appreciate the honorary doctorate, this is just in general, but I have an MFA, which is a terminal degree in art. You know, it's very difficult to get a PhD, but I appreciate that honorary. So yeah, so Master Jennings is cool. So it just makes me uncomfortable because I know how hard it is to get PhD. So just want a point of clarity. So I was thinking about your question, and so one of the first things when we're talking about like comics, we're talking about mainstream superhero comics in particular, right? Because there do seem to be some books that think about like disability and it's graphic novels, original graphic novels. There are some out there. I could probably try to pull together a bibliography, but I think that if we're talking about mainstream superhero comics, first of all, you know, a lot of the mainstream, you know, superhero comics are, well, most of them, all of them are really like white male power fantasies, right? And so a lot of these particular ideas in those particular stories are about performance and about like escapism and things of that nature. And I think because of the fact that we as a species are extremely self-centered and actually don't think about others until we have to. You know, I know it's very simple. It's not necessarily a you know, a super academic answer, but it's just human nature is for us to ignore others until it touches us. You know, it's not a problem until it's at your doorstep, so to speak, right? And so, you know, if you're like, you know, a straight white, you know, heteronormative, quote unquote heteronormative, quote unquote normal bodied, you know, white man, then your proclivities are not going to probably like go that route. So I think that's just just a simple answer about that. The other thing is, you know, if you're looking at superheroes, a lot of it is about embodiment, right? It's about embodiment. And I think so much of what is considered quote unquote disability is really more about systems. You know, it's not necessarily, right? I mean, it's not the fact that your body isn't able. It's about like the society and the system that we're in not being able to deal with differently abled bodies, right? And so I think the comics, you know, mainstream comics aren't set up with that type of imagination, you know, as far as like the systems that we're dealing with. Because the first thing we want to try to do is fix you, right? That's the first thing, you know. And so that's why you have some characters like, for instance, Professor X, I think is a great character, where, you know, or Daredevil, right? Where we're talking about, you know, people who have different abilities, or Hawkeye, for instance, which is a great example, or Echo. But again, we're talking about these notions of performance and fantasy and escapism, right? And the other thing that I think is fear. You know, it's fear. Because basically thinking about a differently able body or a body that is viewed as quote unquote disabled, everybody will probably become, you know, or have an aspect of disability in their lives, right? And so I think that if you're dealing with a power fantasy, and whether it's like because if you're born with some type of birth defect, or if you're born, or if you're in an accident, or if you just grow old and become, you know, everybody grows old and dies. And so I think that's part of it too, is that if we're looking at like, I think that there's very little interest, I think, by mainstream comics to think of people who are differently abled as being powerful. And I think that's a shame. And I think, so to your question, I think there's definitely like a lot of work that needs to be done in that area. But honestly, I think one of the most prevalent ideas is the fact that, you know, these are systemic issues too, and that, you know, the comics in the mainstream and, you know, that come out in the comic book stores that deal with, you know, people with capes just aren't. It's not part of that part discussion. It needs to be, you know. I hope that is that pretty good, or I don't know.
Yeah, no, it was great. I did just want to make a side comment and say that every single person you mentioned was white. So I was going to say, so there's that, but no, for sure.
Oh yeah, for sure. There's also, yeah, we're definitely talking about intersectional issues too, you know, and that's definitely true.
Well,
but I think yeah, go ahead.
There's also what's interesting when you start getting is I mean, there's the power fantasy element of mainstream superheroes, but there's also like a layer of it that part of that, how that power is expressed, is through overcoming limitations and obstacles, right? And I think that and this is I'd argue a limitation of the writers, right? Is so what happens is it's the same problem you have in Star Wars, right? You know, the Jedi keep getting their hands cut off and they just get a new hand, right? And so you created this world with all of these solutions that actually make it hard to understand, even harder to understand disability, right? So you run into the problem of, oh, and by the way, one of the characters you mentioned, Echo, is Native American. So what happens is like with Hawkeye, he loses most of his hearing, and then he gets a hearing aid, and then he can hear just fine. And somehow his hearing aid does not have to apply to the rules of other hearing aids. It just makes him whole instantly, as if that's the goal, right? With no discussion of deaf culture, deaf communities, and what that limitation, or not limitation, that what being deaf for Hawkeye could mean in terms of expanding his constituency as a hero. Because one of the things I'm really intrigued by is that these are power fantasies where power is put in the hands of individuals who then decide what constituents they're going to represent. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the other thing that makes, that in the current construction of superhero comics, it makes it really hard. It's like, okay, Barbara Gordon can't walk, but why doesn't she just get her legs fixed? Because they've got all these other characters who can't walk and they got their legs fixed. And so instead of leaning in as a writer and saying, wait a second, if superheroes are about constituencies, why would that be the solution, right? And so it's a combination of lack of creativity and a world where they've literally created a world where you have to explain why you wouldn't just fix it.
Thank you so much. I know Michal wanted to add something before we move on.
I don't want to sway us too far, but I think it's actually kind of an interesting segue about superheroes and what kind of homegrown superheroes might look like in other places. If we go back to, I don't know if Margaret, you can share your screen again and show us the mural. Let's see if this all works together.
Keep talking, I'll find it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So on her mural, this is very, very striking. There's a black and white character. It really, really jumps out. This character is named Handala. He was drawn by the Palestinian cartoonist Naji El-Ali. Handala is the symbol of Palestinian resistance, and he always stands witnessing with his hands behind his back, and he will never grow up until the Palestinian homeland is returned. That's the idea behind Handala. Handala is like the 0.0 for me of everything I've done with graphic literature, because this is where I started, aside from being in Cairo during this, uprising, in Palestinian literature, I was reading a novel. It has no visuals to it at all, but the character actually meets the cartoonist who draws Handala. So this idea of Handala as being a hero of sorts that moves from the page to the street and then comes into a completely different context here. There's the mural. If you'll scroll down a little bit, if you can see next to George Floyd on the right, that's Handala. And Handala, people wear him on necklaces. There are bumper stickers. Out in the revolution in Cairo, people were carrying Handala placards and stuff. So this is a very, very important symbol. Now, I guess it maybe kind of begs the question, like, what's the difference between a hero and an icon too? Is Handala a hero too? He's definitely a kind of rallying cry for different revolutionary movements, and I think if we're speaking to the kind of transnational element of this, it's just fascinating, this palimpsest here of different images and modalities. So anyway, I just wanted to interject that.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing too to keep in mind, so my daughter, who you see the back of her there, her background from my family is Ojibwe, but her father is Afghan. And so she right away recognized that little character from her grandparents lived for a long time in Gaza and then in Kabul and now in the United States. So she said, oh, it's the little witness, you know? So also that way that I think people have intersectional identities now, and so often society is asking people to fit in one box. But for her, she entered this space as an ally of the Black women who asked us to be there, but as someone who has Persian and Ojibwe background. And so for her, seeing the way these things intersect was interesting for me. I think you're right. There are a lot of ways that we see cultures coming together, and the dominant society wants to read it as just one thing, and it's far more complicated than people tend to realize.
So unfortunately, because this is such an amazing conversation happening and I have so many questions for everyone, but we're running out of time, and I just wanted to take the time to ask one more question, and it's for everyone, to kind of move on then to the Q&A. So all of your work is deeply rooted in identity politics, violence, history, the visibility of stories of people of color, and not only thanks to independent comics, but with social media and digital narratives, these works are becoming more and more accessible to a broader audience, by the day. Where do you see the future of comics and representation? Where would you like to see the future of comics going? And how do you think you can increase the scope of storytelling to bring in even more folks? If that's even, it's a huge question, so tackle it as you will.
I'll jump in really quickly. I think, you're right. I mean, all of the work that I've been doing since I've been in, the academy has been geared towards various modes of representation. And so I think what we really need are more people with journals and, more people who are studying the comics, more people who are gatekeepers, So that's one of the first things that happened is because of the success of the Octavia Butler books. I was able to parlay that into a new space, And so same thing with Mariko Tamaki. She actually has an imprint that's centered around LGBTQ plus folk and stories, right? So I think that's one of the key things is actually kind of open the gate. Try to have as many allies in those spaces too, and people who are willing to go toe to toe with you and stand with you to talk about those issues, because we do need help in those areas too. And as far as the future of comics, I think it's really broad, because up until fairly recently, comics have been treated like the redheaded stepchild of media, right? And still people I still see panels where it's comics, are they literature kind of thing? We're still doing that. Or if I see another panel that says boom, pap, pow, comics, I was like, seriously, that's so 85, Anyway, but so I think there's been progress, but there's still a lot of things that are mired in class and affordances of the medium. We still conflate genre and medium, I think, because when people say comic book industry, I think well, which one, And the other thing, when I think about comics, I think about, well, what genre, what are we talking about when we're talking about comics? A lot of it because of this American notion, this Western notion of comics about superheroes, But that's just depending upon when you look at it, superheroes are a subsection of sci-fi or fantasy or something, right? So anyway, so those are some of my first things I think about, are just making sure that we create these spaces of change and try to keep pushing through.
I think we're living in the change right now. One of my observations has been one of the biggest changes for comics came around 2006 when it became possible for people to do a comic when digital comics became popular, not popular, but possible, right? When we went from from people going to Comic-Cons with their zines to people going to Comic-Cons with an actual comic that they printed up. And I think, you know, with the print on demand services. So I think that what we're experiencing is just an explosion of means of production, right? Before around 2006, 2009, you really needed a publisher to be able to put something out. Now the problem that comic creators are having is not making their comics. It's not producing the comics. It's actually distribution. There's not a viable distribution system for comics right now. You've got comic shops, but comic shops are very limited. I think that one of the things that people are afraid of is, and that seems to be happening, is you've got DC Comics pulling away from comic shops. You've got Marvel Comics, they're probably going to follow suit, and people are like, oh my God, what's going to happen? Well, what's going to happen is you're going to start seeing Marvel and DC Comics at Targets and Walmarts, and these comic shops are going to end up, the ones that survive are going to fill the space by bringing in more independent comics and more local comics. So you're going to start to see a greater emphasis on the local, right? And that's because there is, you know, the thing that is most wonderful about comics is also the thing that makes it really hard to be a comic creator, which is that they are relatively easy to produce, right? So when you have something that's super easy to make, how do you get people to see it? You know, and I've heard all sorts of interesting ideas about ways to move comics, like you know, Ohio State, right? Did you know that you guys, on every Sunday, you guys put more people in a stadium than buy the top selling comic book at a comic shop? Like, what does it say about a national distribution system that can't outsell the ticket booth at your stadium? So we're in a really interesting spot where there's not a real meeting of production and distribution, you know, because you got production, distribution, consumption. The demand is out there. I think that what we're really gonna start seeing is some more experimental comics. You're gonna more experimental comic type things, and I think that the people who are going to thrive are going to be people who aren't worried about what is and is not a comic. They're just going to create really interesting work. You know, I mean, it's like, you know, like Darcy, your piece that you did earlier today, right? I don't get the sense that you were thinking this is what it is. I got the sense that you did the piece. And that's what made that piece great, right? So, and that's the story that I get a lot of times when I speak to creative people. They're less concerned with making something that is the perfect for their media form. They just have something they want to do, some story they want to tell, something that's going to get them through the night, right? And then everything else just kind of follows suit. And then after the fact, we come in as scholars and are like, that's a great comic. I'm saying I don't think that many of them that I know of aren't thinking in those terms. And I'm thinking of a lot of comic creators that are making stuff right now. But no, I'll shut up now.
No, I was going to say, like, I think that was Michal's point earlier about like the remix and how people take from, you know, stories what they want. You know, they take the images and the power, and then they can turn it into something that can be completely sidetracked from what it was initially. I know, Dr. Noodin, you wanted to add something?
No, that's okay. Carry on. Yeah, it's fine.
No. By all means, no. Like it's y'all. I just wanted to ask. I was just making a segue to be like, yeah, I totally agree with everything that Stanford was saying.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, like, with a few minutes here, really quickly, I'll try and show you. Because as you're talking about where is this going now, So this is the art from the book that we're working on, and you can kind of see the way that we're blending things and trying to move things forward. So this character is Wenabujou. He's our kind of cultural hero, and our stories of Wenabujou go back several thousand years. I mean, like people kind of put it around 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, and he transformed into a snake. And so what the artist is doing here is creating a graphic novel, and we've got a story that's bilingual. You see how she's taking this character and blending sort of contemporary graphic novel sensibilities with these traditional ideas of moose hunting. And here's this character that really embodies, I mean, I love it how she throws these little emojis in there and things. And she really has ways of signifying both very traditional old culture and very contemporary culture as well. There might be one here toward the end where you can see, this is a picture of Hegman Lake. And so there you can see the petroglyphs. There literally is a set of petroglyphs that show a moose, a very large person, the wolf, and a line that represents the Milky Way. And so basically we have a petroglyph that goes back, that you can see it was this actual early graphic novel. If you look up Hegman Lake, you can find that image on stone. And then we have this story that's been told about it. And now that's what we're trying to kind of retell in this graphic novel form. In terms of how we get it out there, it's also really super down to earth, really basic. So we have a press where we do it our way, and we just kind of put it out there in the way that we think is best, and we can be really true to our culture. So I put a link to that press on the chat, just because it's also fine to just, you know, you meet your audience, and if you only make 1,000 copies, you get them all to the right 1,000 people, and that's maybe all that matters.
That is just unreal, those images that you just showed. I almost can't say anything after that, but I guess I would just add that, you know, from my perspective, I think teaching is where I can make the biggest difference, and hopefully some of my students are out there listening to these panels. I definitely invited them, but I think the second that people have these like moments where they can put together all of these concepts, it's very, very powerful. And I mean, as a literature person, I think of ourselves as kind of narrative beings walking around the world, being our own protagonists in our own stories. And so making those connections can be very, very powerful. And yeah, I guess that's where I think that I can make a difference, is getting people to see some of those connections.
Okay, no, I'm good.
All right, oh, wow, okay. There are a lot of, people are doing awesome things. I'm like, you guys are all amazing. Thank you so much for all your awesome work. I don't know if anyone in the chat has any questions. I don't think I've seen any pop up yet.
Well, we did have one. We actually did have one from JM, and we have just a few minutes. So this is a question for everyone. Basically, JM asks, do you all feel that multicultural people can carve a space for intersectionality comics and literature? He says that most time multicultural peoples or biracial peoples, aka mixed races, struggle with identity and trying to live in, trying to norm in mainstream. So I guess, you know, there's a question here about like how multiculturalism, which we had talked about a little bit with Cass, but basically how intersectionality and like multicultural identity can carve a separate space inside, I guess, this question of, you know, comics and graphic novels centered around people of color.
I'll just say 2 words really quick. Yes. I mean, I think that what I'm always imagining is that next generation, like what I was bringing up, I hope my daughters can imagine heroes that are, they always say they're Persian-abe, so Anishinaabe and Persian, and everybody should be able to find or create the hero, the character, the story that resonates with them. So I hope that we get to where we don't feel we have to fit into the stereotype boxes. And I'll just say that.
I'll just say, I'll piggyback on what Margaret's saying and say yes as well. I mean, I think conferences and spaces like this are testimonies to that, right? And also, if you're not seeing the spaces happening, you know, then you have to create your own. I mean, we've been talking about, you know, Octavia Butler's work a lot. I mean, she pretty much like wrote herself into existence. You know, you know what I'm saying? Like, she was like, this is a space that I need to be a part of, and I'm going to create work that actually like edifies me and actually centers what, you know, what I'm thinking about. I think, or people like Toni Morrison, of course, right? Writing her own truth and pushing forward. So I think, yes. The other thing you have to realize is that you're not in it by yourself. You know, that other people are out there feeling like this too. So try to create networks and, you know, create spaces of change together, you know. But I think, like, you know, ethnocentric conventions like SoulCon and BCAF and, you know, ECBAC and the different spaces, or even Indigicon spaces like that are really kind of like at the forefront of talking about these issues. And I think we just have to remember that we're not by ourselves, and we are a community, and we can rely on each other to push forward. So.
I was gonna say, Dr. Carpenter, do you want to give us a final word in the last few minutes that we have?
I mean, I have to say, I've really enjoyed this con. And I think that, you know, I hope that, you know, I feel like Margaret and John have very much answered the question. But I'm also really curious and hopeful about what's going to come next. I mean, I'm looking at the evolution of SoulCon, and I'm looking at this also as also as just seeing the work that's come out of SoulCon as a space since the first SoulCon I went to, and seeing similar things happen at other smaller conventions, where the conventions have now been around long enough that if you've been to enough of them, you've actually seen people grow from coming to meet their favorite artists, or to be introduced to artists of color, to becoming artists of color, right? And so seeing those cycles gives me a real sense of hope, especially as we talk about the whole issue of representation. You know, I mean, we may not necessarily be happy with representation as it stands now, but it's better than it was yesterday, and yesterday was better than the day before, right? And so that's what I'm taking away from this.
Thank you so much for everyone today. You guys were amazing. And like I said in the chat, I literally want to be all of you when I grow up, because I'm still a child. And with that, we're going to finish our last panel of the day. And I'm going to turn things over to Katie, just so that she can finish up the day and give us a few words. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yes, thank you.
Everybody,
Thank
so
you.
much. Seriously, as your central coordinator for SoulCon this year and for last year, I literally could not have asked for a better day. Of course, everybody who has talked with me in even a limited capacity knows that this has been quite a challenge to kind of replan the SoulCon that we had originally conceptualized and imagined back in January. And so I'm really grateful to y'all for spending the time with us. I want to shout out some of our attendees who've actually been with us since 9 a.m. There's folks who've made it through the whole day, which I thought it was just going to be a couple of us, but I really want to just thank you all for being in this space, and for, I think, you know, it makes me really excited to kind of think about this moment that we're in, and thinking about how we're sustaining this work and retaining this work so that it continue to do these big things. So truly, from the bottom of my heart, I love you very, very much. Thank you so much to our moderators and our panelists. Also, shout out to Alex Thompson, who's been keeping time behind the scenes. I'm really excited to say that we've maintained time throughout the entire day, which has been challenging with a continuous stream. But also shout out to the Billy Ireland and Caitlin McGurk, who has been the tech genius behind this. It is a labor of love, but it's also a labor of love that's, you know, been done by BIPOC folks, because we're always doing that work behind the scenes, and this makes me really happy to see us also in the foreground. So thank you. Please come visit us tomorrow. From 12 to 5, we'll have Expo Day panels, and then we'll have asynchronous video premieres on YouTube on Saturday. But this is us signing off and thanking you so much for spending your time with us.